Okay, picture this. You're standing in a remote campground. It's mid-July in Idaho in 2015. A frantic mother rushes up to you screaming that her 2-year-old son is missing. She tells you he was wearing oversized cowboy boots and was last seen with his great-grandfather. What would you do? Would you have any reason not to believe her? This exact scenario confronted the first sheriff deputy who arrived at Timber Creek Campground, a desolate location miles from civilization where DeOrr Kunz Jr. disappeared. Today, I'm walking you through this case from the investigator's perspective as they peeled back the layers of a story filled with inconsistencies. By the end, you'll understand why, after nearly a decade with no resolution, this case haunts everyone involved. Join me for another odd, mysterious story here at Odd Mystery Stories. Imagine the unthinkable happens. Your child vanishes without a trace. Most parents become frozen in time, their lives permanently suspended in that moment of loss. They often remain near the last place their child was seen, clinging to hope and memories. But for Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz, the parents of missing DeOrr Kunz Jr., life moved forward at a pace that raised eyebrows among both investigators and the public. While the search for their son remained officially active, both parents charted life paths that deviated sharply from what experts typically observe in missing children's cases. Jessica Mitchell remarried merely 8 months after her son's disappearance, a timeline investigators found unusually accelerated. Vernal Kunz similarly established a fresh start by relocating out of state and remarrying, placing physical and emotional distance between himself and the painful memories of Idaho. Their rapid transitions created the impression of people shedding an old life rather than parents suspended in the limbo of uncertainty. These actions stood in stark contrast to established patterns observed in thousands of similar cases. Parents of missing children typically demonstrate prolonged periods of intense grief, becoming fixtures in their communities as they continue search efforts for years or some even decades. Many refuse to move from their homes, fearing their missing child might return to find no one waiting. Some maintain their child's bedroom exactly as it was on the day of the disappearance, a shrine to frozen hope. Jessica and Vernal, however, appeared almost eager to escape the gravity of their tragedy. While grief manifests differently for everyone, their quick transitions to new relationships, homes, and identities struck experienced investigators as a troubling aberration, like travelers hurriedly leaving a station before the train had even arrived. The professionals who initially stepped forward to help soon became their most vocal critics. Frank Vilt, a retired U.S. Marshal who volunteered his services, abruptly withdrew from the case after working closely with the parents. In a pointed letter he wrote, "I told both of you that if I felt you were not telling the truth, stalling me, or otherwise misleading me, that I would withdraw from the investigation. Both of you lied and misrepresented the true facts that could solve the mystery of your missing son." This accusation from someone who had initially been an ally sent shockwaves throughout the case. Even more damning was the assessment from Philip Klein, a private investigator later hired by the family. After conducting his own investigation, Klein concluded, "I don't think it was an intentional homicide. I think it was an accident, and it's a cover-up on an accident." His statement suggested the parents knew precisely what happened to DeOrr, but were concealing the truth. For law enforcement, these behaviors couldn't be ignored. The parents' personal rebuilding occurred while the most basic questions about DeOrr remained unanswered. No trace of the boy had been found, no clothing, no remains, nothing to provide closure or explanation. Yet his parents appeared to have found their own form of closure, moving forward with lives that seemed surprisingly untethered to the ongoing mystery of their missing son. These inconsistencies created a troubling narrative for investigators. If DeOrr's parents were truly innocent and desperately hoping for his return, why would they so quickly reconstruct lives that left little room for that possibility? The timeline of their personal decisions became as much a part of the investigation as the timeline of the day DeOrr vanished. Behind every missing child case sits a real child whose essence can't be captured in official reports. Those who followed DeOrr Kunz Jr.'s disappearance know him primarily as a statistic, a 2-year-old who vanished from an Idaho campsite. But to understand the gravity of what happened that day in July 2015, we need to see the little boy beyond the headlines. DeOrr was a magnetic child with blonde hair framing curious hazel eyes and chubby cheeks that would light up when he smiled. His spirit truly defined him, simultaneously adventurous, yet deeply attached to his parents, earning him the nicknames Mommy's Boy and Daddy's Little Mini-Me. This dichotomy made him who he was, a curious explorer who still needed the security of his loved ones nearby. Like many toddlers, DeOrr had discovered his independence but relied on comfort and protection. He delighted in making his mother laugh, his playful antics revealing an emerging personality full of mischief and joy. On that fateful July morning, DeOrr seemed like his usual self. He ate breakfast with his family, played around the campsite, and anticipated another day of outdoor adventure. No one imagined it would be his last day seen alive. What makes this case particularly haunting are the personal items left behind, objects that reveal more about DeOrr's disappearance than witness statements ever could. Most revealing were his beloved blanket and stuffed monkey. These weren't just random toys. They were essential companions for a child his age, as vital to his sense of security as an anchor is to a ship in unfamiliar waters. Parents of toddlers understand the absolute necessity of these comfort objects. They're items packed first for any trip, the companions needed for peaceful bedtimes, the anchors providing security in unfamiliar places. For DeOrr to have voluntarily wandered away without them contradicts everything we understand about toddler psychology. Then there were his boots, those oversized cowboy boots he loved so much. Picture a 2-year-old navigating through rough mountain terrain in boots too big for his tiny feet. Any parent can tell you how challenging it is for toddlers to walk steadily, even in properly fitted shoes on flat surfaces. In oversized boots on uneven ground, the scenario becomes increasingly implausible. Child development experts confirm that a typical 2-year-old would struggle significantly with independent movement in such conditions. Their balance is still developing, their coordination limited, and their walking abilities easily compromised by terrain challenges. Ill-fitting footwear suggests DeOrr wandering far from camp under his own power as highly questionable. The morning of the camping trip highlights another dimension of who DeOrr was. As he played around the campsite, his natural curiosity was on display. But this was an unfamiliar environment, not the type of place a child with strong parental attachment would likely venture away from voluntarily, especially without those treasured comfort items. What's particularly disturbing is how these personal details directly contradict the theory that DeOrr simply wandered off. A toddler deeply attached to his parents, who needed his blanket and monkey for security, who wore boots that would have made independent hiking nearly impossible. How does that child vanish without a trace in rugged wilderness? These seemingly small details are critical evidence challenging the wandering off narrative. The physical items left behind paint a picture of a child who either couldn't or wouldn't have ventured off alone, a revelation that forced investigators to look more critically at the adults present that day. Those oversized boots weren't the only thing that didn't quite fit this disturbing puzzle. As investigators began piecing together what happened at Timber Creek Campground on July 10, 2015, They discovered something potentially more damning than any physical evidence. 4 adults telling 4 fundamentally incompatible versions of the same critical events. When a child vanishes without a trace, consistency matters, but consistency was precisely what this case lacked. The contradictions centered around the single most important question: who was watching DeOrr during those final moments before he vanished? Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz claimed that they briefly left their son with Robert Walton, who is Jessica's grandfather, while they explored the area. A simple explanation until Robert directly contradicted them. "I never heard Jessica ask me to watch DeOrr," Robert told investigators, demolishing his granddaughter's claim. This wasn't a minor memory lapse or a misunderstanding about timing. It was a fundamental disagreement about who held responsibility for the toddler during those critical moments. Isaac Reinwand, Robert's friend who joined the camping trip despite their relationship not being particularly close, introduced yet another contradictory version. He told authorities he had seen DeOrr walking with his parents towards the creek, completely undermining Jessica and Vernal's claim they had left their son with Robert. How could DeOrr be simultaneously with his parents and with his great-grandfather? It was an impossibility. Even the parents couldn't maintain consistency between themselves. When questioned about how long they were away from the campsite, Jessica insisted it was merely about 5 minutes, barely enough to walk a short distance. Vernal, however, estimated they were gone for 15 to 20 minutes, a significant difference when accounting for a missing child. Was this simply a perception difference between two stressed parents, or was someone deliberately manipulating the timeline? As investigators continued interviewing the 4 adults over subsequent days and weeks, their stories just didn't remain inconsistent, they actively evolved. Each telling brought brand new details, altered sequences, and shifting blame about who was responsible for the child's supervision. For seasoned investigators, these inconsistencies weren't random. Sheriff Lynn Bowerman would later state that the parents were, quote, less than truthful during interviews, a diplomatic way of saying he believed that they were lying. Isaac Reinwand presented his own puzzling element to the investigation. Reports indicated that he may have had cognitive limitations that potentially affected his reliability as a witness. Yet, this didn't explain why his account so specifically contradicted the others. Was he confused, manipulated, or perhaps the only one telling the truth? Law enforcement officers are trained to spot inconsistencies in witness statements, but rarely do they encounter a case where 4 adults, present at the same location, cannot agree on the most basic sequence of events. These weren't disagreements about peripheral details. They centered on who was watching DeOrr. In a missing child investigation, establishing a clear timeline and chain of custody is crucial. Here, investigators faced 4 adults whose stories fractured beyond recognition. For the detectives working on the case, these narrative inconsistencies raised an alarming possibility. When witnesses can't keep their story straight, it typically suggests one of two things: either confusion born from genuine trauma and shock, or deliberate deception. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement increasingly leaned toward the second possibility. Think about it. If DeOrr genuinely wandered away while someone wasn't watching, why would all 4 adults simply not admit that tragic mistake? Parents who lose sight of their children make terrible errors in judgment every day. Yet, instead of a straightforward admission of negligence, investigators encountered a web of contradicting stories that seemed designed to hide something far worse than a momentary lapse in supervision, leaving authorities to wonder what terrible truth might lie beneath the surface of these conflicting accounts. Beyond the tangled web of contradictions at the campsite lies another timeline that simply doesn't add up. Imagine driving your child to multiple stores across town, spending nearly an hour shopping for diesel fuel and snacks. Yet, Not a single person remembers seeing your toddler. What innocent explanation could possibly account for store employees who specifically recalled seeing Jessica and Vernal that morning, along with an empty car seat? The morning shopping trip on July 10, 2015, should have been unremarkable. According to Jessica and Vernal, after breakfast at the campsite, they took DeOrr with them on a quick errand to DeOrr to purchase diesel fuel and snacks. It was just a routine part of their camping trip, or so they claimed. But this seemingly mundane detail would eventually become one of the case's most troubling contradictions. When investigators interviewed employees at the local stores in DeOrr, they encountered something bizarre. Not a single witness recalled seeing a child with the couple that morning. One witness specifically remembered seeing an empty car seat in their vehicle, directly contradicting the parents' insistence that DeOrr was with them. 2-year-olds, especially active ones like DeOrr, typically leave an impression, grabbing items, making noise, requiring attention. Yet, store staff who interacted with his parents noticed his absence. The couple's route that morning resembled a jigsaw puzzle with mismatched pieces. Rather than driving to the nearest gas station, they embarked on a puzzling journey across town. First, they stopped at a convenience store that didn't even sell diesel fuel. After that unsuccessful attempt, they visited another location, completely out of gas, before finally finding diesel at Peterson's Welding. This circuitous route transformed a quick errand into a lengthy excursion. Time discrepancies further fractured their story. Initially, Jessica and Vernal claimed they were only gone from the campsite for about 5 minutes. Physically impossible given the distance. Timber Creek Campground sits approximately 10 miles from DeOrr, meaning even under ideal conditions, the round trip would require at least 20 to 30 minutes of driving time alone, not counting their multiple stops. Later, Vernal adjusted his story, claiming they were gone for 15 to 20 minutes. Still, insufficient time for their documented activities. The receipts from their purchases created a paper trail contradicting their statements about how long they were away from the campsite. These inconsistencies raised the disturbing question. If DeOrr wasn't with his parents during their morning shopping trip as witnesses suggest, where was he? And why would Jessica and Vernal insist he was with them if he wasn't? Law enforcement took particular notice of this timeline issue. If the parents weren't truthful about having DeOrr with them that morning, it dramatically shifted possibilities about when the child actually disappeared, and whether the reported timeline at the campsite was fabricated. Consider the sequence. Witnesses confirmed seeing Jessica and Vernal in town without DeOrr. Later that same day, at approximately 2:28 p.m., the couple called 911, reporting their son had been missing for about an hour. If DeOrr wasn't with them during the morning trip, the timeline of his disappearance shifts dramatically backward, opening troubling questions about what happened that day. Some investigators began considering an even more disturbing possibility. What if DeOrr was never at the campsite that day at all? The store clerk's recollection of seeing an empty car seat that morning, coupled with the parents' unusual shopping route and inconsistent time estimates, transformed this ordinary errand into a critical puzzle piece that changed how investigators viewed the entire case. What started as a search for a missing child who wandered away was transforming into something far more sinister, a possible cover-up. As suspicions of a cover-up intensified, the case took a dramatic turn when a dedicated child advocate stepped forward to help. Imagine volunteering your expertise, investing your personal resources, and pledging your reputation to find the missing child, only to walk away from the case convinced the parents were hiding something sinister. This devastating reversal wouldn't happen just once, but twice, as professional investigators reached conclusions so disturbing they couldn't continue working with the family. Frank Vilt, a retired U.S. Marshal with extensive experience in child disappearance cases, initially seemed like a blessing for the Kunz family. He personally offered reward money to help locate little DeOrr, demonstrating commitment beyond professional interest. Parents of missing children typically embrace such allies, especially those with law enforcement backgrounds. Yet, something changed dramatically during his investigation. After examining evidence and interviewing the parents, Vilt transformed from supporter to accuser. His withdrawal letter stated unambiguously, "I told both of you, if I felt that you weren't telling the truth, stalling me, or otherwise misleadingly, I would withdraw from the investigation. In my professional opinion, both of you lied and misrepresented the true facts that could solve the mystery of your missing son." This wasn't merely frustration with a difficult case. It was a professional assessment from someone who had devoted his career to finding the truth. What had Vilt uncovered that transformed his view so completely? Facing a credibility crisis after Vilt's departure, the family hired another professional investigator, Philip Klein from Texas, who arrived with confidence that he could unravel the mystery where others had failed. Rather than vindicating the parents as they likely had hoped, Klein's investigation revealed even more troubling discoveries that aligned with Vilt's conclusions. Perhaps most damning was the discovery of DeOrr's camouflage jacket from Jessica's storage unit, a jacket that the parents had claimed the child was wearing when he vanished. This evidence fundamentally undermined their account at Timber Creek, suggesting deliberate deception rather than confusion. Klein publicly stated his belief that the parents knew what happened to their son. "I don't think it was an intentional homicide. I think it was an accident. And its cover-up on an accident, if it is a cover-up of an accident, just come clean." He said his theory reflected a developing consensus among investigators that the parents were hiding a tragic accident rather than a premeditated crime. The investigator made an even more disturbing claim. Jessica had allegedly told investigators she knew where DeOrr's body was, but refused to reveal the location. This admission, if true, would transform the case from mysterious disappearance to confirmed death with concealment of remains. The parents responded by firing Klein, following the same pattern as with Vilt, and filing a defamation lawsuit claiming slander, fraud, and breach of contract, and infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit's dismissal by a judge who noted the truth is the ultimate defense dealt another blow to their credibility. What's striking is the identical trajectory of both investigations. Two separate professionals, approaching the case at different times with different methods, started as allies of the family. Both independently concluded the parents were concealing critical information. Both publicly broke with the family over truthfulness issues. The statistical likelihood of two experienced investigators reaching identical false conclusions seems vanishingly small. Professional investigators develop finely tuned instincts for deception through years of interviewing witnesses and suspects. They recognize patterns in stories that don't align with evidence, detect inconsistencies casual observers might miss, and identify behavioral red flags suggesting hidden information. For both Vilt and Klein to stake their professional reputations on such serious accusations suggests they discovered compelling evidence never fully revealed to the public. 6 months after DeOrr's disappearance, what had been whispered behind closed doors finally entered the public record. While the private investigators had reached their own conclusions, law enforcement was preparing to take the case in a direction that would shock the tight-knit Idaho community that had been praying for a miracle. The investigation had reached a breaking point. After months of conflicting statements and troubling inconsistencies, on January 25, 2016, County Sheriff Lynn Bowerman stepped before news cameras with a statement that changed everything. After weeks of interviewing, re-interviewing, and an announcement from the FBI that they were being less than truthful on their polygraphs, a lot of irregularities and discrepancies in their interviews, I felt it was necessary to come forward and say that the parents are being less than truthful. With those carefully chosen words, the sheriff officially named Jessica Mitchell and Vernal Kunz as suspects in their own son's disappearance. These weren't persons of interest. They were formally suspected of involvement in whatever had happened to their child. The polygraph results were crucial in the sheriff's decision. While experts debate the reliability of lie detector tests, investigators consider them valuable tools. Sheriff Bowerman specified, "The FBI has indicated that they were being less than truthful on their polygraphs. Though classified as inconclusive rather than definitively failed, these results raised serious red flags when combined with the inconsistencies plaguing the parents' accounts. The investigation had methodically eliminated other possibilities." Bowerman stated clearly, "We have ruled out the abduction, we have ruled out wild animals, and just your general thought tells you that if there was an accident, there's no reason not to come forward." This elimination process left investigators with a disturbing conclusion. Consider the evidence against an animal attack. In wilderness areas, predations leave distinctive signs: disturbed ground, torn clothing, blood evidence. Search teams with cadaver dogs found nothing. The pristine nature of the search area contradicted what would happen if a predator had taken a small child. Similarly, the abduction theory fell apart under scrutiny. The remote location, specific timing, and absence of evidence pointing to an unknown third party made this increasingly implausible. A remote campsite with limited access and 4 adult witnesses presents an extremely high-risk scenario for a potential abductor. The investigation transformed. What began as a search for a missing toddler now carried the hallmarks of a potential homicide case. Resources shifted from search operations toward building a case that could lead to criminal charges. For the community that rallied around the family, the sheriff's announcement created painful cognitive dissonance. These were the same parents who had appeared on television pleading for help. Local residents had donated time, money, and resources. Prayer vigils had been held. Now they had to reconcile their compassion with the possibility that the parents themselves might be responsible. Reactions divided predictably. Some defended Jessica and Vernal, pointing to their public grief as evidence of innocence. Others recalled the inconsistencies, the changing stories, the questionable timeline, the unusual behaviors. The community united in search of DeOrr now found itself divided over questions of guilt. Perhaps most puzzling is that despite naming the parents as suspects, no arrest followed. Sheriff Bowerman acknowledged this unusual situation. "We haven't been able to clear any of those people that were in the campground with DeOrr. This suggests that while investigators strongly suspect the parents' involvement, they haven't assembled the evidence necessary for a conviction." This limbo is common in cases without a body or definitive forensic evidence. Prosecutors typically proceed only when they believe they can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The bar for arrest is lower than for conviction, but law enforcement often proceeds cautiously in high-profile cases where a failed prosecution might permanently close the door to justice. July 10, 2025 marks a somber milestone in this haunting mystery. 10 long years, a decade has passed since little DeOrr vanished from Timber Creek Campground. A decade without answers, justice, or closure for a community that still remembers the blue-eyed boy who disappeared into thin air. Despite the passage of time, Justice for Baby DeOrr groups continue their tireless advocacy, refusing to let this case fade into obscurity like so many other missing children. Their continued efforts stand in stark contrast to lives that have moved forward around this frozen moment. The truth remains tantalizingly close, locked in the memories of those present that day. Someone knows what happened. Someone holds the key. What theory makes the most sense to you? Could re-examining the evidence reveal what we've missed all along? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Hey, thank you for joining me in another odd mystery. My name is Vince. If you enjoyed this story, you might also be interested in the story of the mysterious case of the missing Hoggle children. You'll find the link to that story in the upper right corner of your screen. Your support helps keep these stories alive, giving the affected families the hope they seek. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. And for those who'd like to further support the channel, be sure to check out our online store for exclusive merch and more. I appreciate you. Thank you.